Aloha nui kako. Just going to continue on from our lecture last class. This will be part two of three actual lectures dealing with the question of language, specifically language revitalization, education, and culture. So I'm not going to go through all of the slides that we did last time, but just to kind of remember. An important aspect of last class was looking at the question of, as Inguliwa Thiongo has put forward, this idea of what's called the cultural bomb. And so that's kind of an underlying idea behind this particular lecture. And let me kind of go into our, let me see if I can get into a present mode. Make it a little easier. And maybe make this a little bigger here. But sorry. And let me just stop when I get to the point where we left off last class. And first of all, we talked about some important concepts such as miseducation. We talked about the idea of mental colonization and how that works, especially with ideas of to deculture people, deculturalization, miseducation, Euro-Americanization, of course, and in the end, denationalization. Concepts such as menticide and the purpose of that action, menticide. Conceptual incarceration, how we are imprisoned in the way we think, what we think we can do, what we see as being possible, and what we see as being perhaps even moral. The murder machine. We talked about American Indian schools, especially through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and how the schools, of course, were used as the process of assimilation, and of course the words kill the Indian and save the man. And that this is something you find all over the world, whether it's South Africa, and of course in Hawaii. And so last class we got briefly into, again, this is from the reading by Warner. You can refer to that reading, and he talks kind of a background about the Hawaiian language situation, especially in regards to what we call the Manaleo, or the Hawaiian language native speakers, and the fact at that time in 1996, so this is 25 years ago, there were less than 1,000 so-called Manaleo at that time. Today we have several thousand Hawaiian language speakers, mainly children, but whether or not we can consider them to be Manaleo is something that still is debated, in that many of those who speak Hawaiian today don't have Hawaiian as their first language, as the household language that are passed down from generation upon generation, except for, of course, the Hawaiians from the island of Niihau. And so, kind of getting to what I wanted to get into today, this is the main lecture of today, is to kind of understand the history and a little bit about the Hawaiian language. Of course, Hawaiian language is part of the Polynesian language system, and as part of the family, if we looked at the, let's see if I have a marker that I could actually use, that, this area here, well, most of this area kind of should be like a triangle, of course, is so-called the Polynesian languages, and that, when we think about older Polynesia or Proto-Polynesia or Western Polynesia, this is the original of the origins of the Hawaiian language, and again, has to do with the settlement. And then, roughly about 2,000 years ago, we started to go east, we started to go up north, we started to traverse the whole, of course, Pacific, all the way to Easter Island, and up north to Hawaii, and down south to, in fact, New Zealand. Yeah. But when we think about the so-called language family, or Proto-Polynesian language family, we kind of think about the language going all the way from Easter Island and actually extends through the Malay area, in fact, into as far as Madagascar of Africa. And so the language that the Polynesian language comes from, in fact, is a very old and ancient language that really covers the largest space upon this planet. Let me see where I'm at now. Click off, yeah, done. And just move up. Next slide. And let me see. So, as I had shared, yeah, when we think about, in a sense, first cousins, yeah, we can think of the, Central Eastern Polynesian languages, whether from Tahiti and Marquesas, Rarotonga, Maori, and of course, including Hawaiian, and those from Easter Island as really kind of being all first cousins, very, very close. And our second cousins is that this is our ancestral language and homeland, of course, are the language of Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji, which would be like second cousins. Okay. The great Apriana Ata, and this is from the reading, a very short reading entitled Tokureo Toku Mana. My voice is my mana. And in this reading, comparative, of course, to the people of so-called New Zealand today, the Aotearoa. These words, ki te kore koe e mohio ki te korero Maori, e hara koe I te Maori. And, justly what he's saying is, if you don't think of speaking the Maori language, if you cannot speak Maori, then maybe you should question, perhaps you're not Maori, that the foundation of being Maori is think in a Maori way. And of course, language is the key to understanding of people's culture and the way they think. And therefore, the language is where you get your so-called mana. The article also talks a little bit about the revitalization of the Maori language in their Kohangareo systems and their Kurekaupapa system. And that, where the language really had been lost the most by the so-called maybe Maori that had been forced to move into the cities, away from their so-called homelands. They also probably had more opportunities in regards to education, and really they become the vanguard. They, in a sense, become the vanguard of those who see the value of language and education and really lead the movement towards Maori education. And so when you think about the Maori educational system, it's really Maori as a language, which is the blood, in a sense, of this body. But the whole question of education really is the key for the Maori people. So a lot of the Hawaiian language schools and Hawaiian immersion schools that we have here are really based upon and related to these Kohangareo and Kurekaupapa schools that we have. Now, a little bit about Hawaiian history, of course, we should recognize that the so-called missionaries, the Calvinist missionaries, the ABCFM, the American Board of Christian Foreign Missions, the Calvinists, came in 1820 on the Thaddeus. And their main purpose, of course, was conversion, to create a state where you would convert the Hawaiian population. And really, for the first couple of years, they had a very difficult time, very hard program in really getting the Hawaiians to convert. But one of the things that they did have, and really what happens is a missionary by the name of Ellis comes from Tahiti. He's very accustomed to Tahitian language and Tahitian culture. And he basically shows them the blueprint, which is to use the technology of reading and writing, literacy, really to be, because what he has, correctly analyzed was that Hawaiians would become very, very attracted to literacy, and therefore this is how they would be able to get into the so-called Hawaiian families and communities. And this is a quick way they were able to start to convert Hawaiians. And of course, the Bible became the main reading tool and instrument, and of course, educational instrument. And really, in one generation, Native Hawaiians took to literacy. And really, you're talking in 20 years, the Hawaiian people went from being almost virtually totally illiterate society to one in 20 years to become considered, if not the most literate society in the world. And now we can look at the data of 1853, where 3/4 of the Hawaiian people were literate. This is very high in comparison to other parts of the world. And all you got to look at is world history. You can start off with the United States. The Hawaiian population was definitely at least 2 to 3 times more literate than the so-called white Americans themselves. If you compare it to places like Europe, very much so. Hawaiians were way more literate. And of course, it goes to the idea of who is education for. And it's really clear, of course, in the Hawaiians' ideas that education and literacy was for everyone, in comparison to Euro-American societies where literacy and education really was just for the wealthy or for those who came from the aristocracy, perhaps. And that for the masses of people, reading and writing was something that was, if you were lucky to have gone to school, you may have learned to read and write. You may have spent a couple of years in school, but it wasn't seen as something in which everyone or education was meant for the so-called masses. Now, the Hawaiian writing system really is developed and pushed by the American missionaries that came in 1820. And as they start to go into the community, they start to engage, of course, with Hawaiian people. And, one of the interesting facts about Hawaiian literacy is that it's really the Hawaiians who teach Hawaiians very quickly how to read and write. That there are many letters you can read and examples where the missionaries will come upon, a new ahupua'a traveling through the islands. And when they by the time they get there, they already realize that the Hawaiians are already able to read and write. And, Hawaiians kind of use a particular writing system called hakalama. And as you can see, the Hawaiian language is very phonetic, very phonetic. So it's kind of a very easy language to figure out that what you see written is the sound. And that you see as the sound as written is exactly how you would pronounce or read. And so, we don't have any, silent letters, or we don't have, I before E except after C, those kinds of rules in spelling and writing. In fact, like I said, Hawaiian is very, very clear. What you see exactly is how you're going to pronounce it. And so the missionaries actually, as you can see this quote here, they talk about where a 14-year-old boy, illiterate, will be put into a classroom, and virtually in a month, just a month, that child will become totally literate, both in reading and writing. And it's a couple of things. One is that Hawaiians are very, very hungry to learn this technology of reading and writing. But more importantly, is that the Hawaiian language, because the written form is very phonetic, it's actually a lot easier perhaps to master and to learn the orthography of the language. We have a couple of, 13 so-called letters and combinations of sounds. But we also have a couple of markings that we use. One is called the okina, or it's called the glottostop, which is an actual letter. Yeah, it's a consonant. And we also have what's called the mekona or kahako, which you notice on this word here on the right, that marks vowels, that can mark vowels. And really, in a simple sense, it elongates the sound of the vowel. Now, we should also recognize, that because of this literacy, the Hawaiian Kingdom period is really a period of quick development of the scholastic achievements and the academics of the so-called Hawaiian Kingdom period, where by 1839, in fact, the Hawaiian Kingdom already creates a Declaration of Rights in written form. And this is pretty early in world history in comparison to other parts of the so-called world. And in fact, by 1840, we already have a written constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And again, these are things in which the masses could all read and really understand. Now, this is in comparison to other parts of the so-called world. We can compare it to the United States, perhaps, where only a minority of American citizens could actually read and write the Declaration of Independence, let alone the U.S. Constitution. In 1843, the Hawaiian Kingdom, of course, is recognized as an independent nation state, part of the family of nations, and this is whereby the Hawaiians, in a sense, prove themselves as being a so-called civilized nation and become the first non-European nation state to be recognized to be part of the so-called family of nations. We We also had some very interesting ideas, especially in regards to language. And what you find, however, you'll never find any kind of legal instrument where anyone in Hawaii was forced, in a sense, to speak or write in Hawaiian. That in fact, depending upon where you came from as an immigrant to Hawaii or settler to Hawaii, that in fact you would not be discriminated against because of not having the ability to speak or write in Hawaiian language. Now, obviously, real quickly, because everything within the Hawaiian Kingdom ran via the Hawaiian language and managed via the Hawaiian language, everyone really in the Hawaiian Kingdom quickly became proficient and literate, both in speaking and writing in the Hawaiian language. And therefore, this is the period, like I said, when our literacy rate, in fact, was very, very high in comparison to the world. Our main textbook early on, again, comes from the so-called Holy Bible, brought by the missionaries, and it kind of becomes the first, written form that's used as a textbook. But quickly, Hawaiians start to create many different reading material that's spread out throughout all of Hawaii. Again, this is an example just to see the Hawaiian Constitution. Uhana mai ke akua ina lau I ka nakaapau I ke kokoho kahi. Now, what's interesting about the Hawaiian Constitution of 1840, just to see the opening lines, it talks about that God had made the peoples of the earth to, again, all be equal, to all share one blood. But it's interesting to recognize when in the Hawaiian Constitution of 1840, when the Hawaiian Constitution talk about equality of all people, the humanity of all peoples, all you got to do, of course, is compare to what the United States was in 1840. And you would quickly see, in fact, the United States themselves, slavery was still growing strong in 1840. And so the idea of anyone of color, or especially from Africa, or which were enslaved and brought to the United States, were not afforded equal rights and very much treated, in fact, you could argue, to way into the future as being less than so-called civilized or human being. We can look at American Indians or Native Americans at this time in 1840. We just had moved a whole bunch of Native peoples out of places like Georgia and so-called through the Trail of Tears and the so-called Cherokee people. But American Indians themselves were still considered so-called savages and, in fact, non-citizens of the United States. So when you look in regards to comparison, in regards to U.S. American Constitution versus the Hawaiian Constitution, we look at ideas of justice and equality for all. It's very clear in the Hawaiian Constitution that not just put in words, but something that was actually followed by the people of Hawaii. Just again, examples of the 1840 constitutions I had referred to. So you can see 1840. We had early on, from 1834, our first Hawaiian language newspapers coming out of Lahaina Luna. Yeah, so you think of Lahaina Luna, the first school out of Hawaii, really the first school out of the Pacific, and as people say, the first school west of the so-called Rocky Mountains was established on the slopes of Lahaina, above Lahaina town, a school called Lahaina Luna. And early on, Lahaina Luna began to publish these newspaper articles, printed and shared throughout the islands. And it's an example of the kind of articles that they would have, of course, example of explanation of a hippopotamus that, of course, the people of Hawaii had never seen before, but, must have been hot news back at that time to learn and read about the so-called hippopotamus, which kind of shows how worldly our people were also. They weren't just looking and learning about things that were happening in Hawaii, but in Hawaiians at this time was very much hungry to learn and have knowledge about things throughout the world. Here's an example, of course, another newspaper. This was actually a government newspaper entitled Kanona Nona, or the ant, and you can see a picture of a eel. If you wanted to read a daily account of what happened during the Civil War, this is an example where, just to understand that even Hawaiians, the Hawaiian King time, we're, because of a high literacy rate, we're reading about events and histories around the world that you can actually read about things like the Civil War in the Hawaiian language. You can see on the right here, much of the advertisements, like ads that you'd find in newspapers, were also, of course, in the Hawaiian language. Yeah. And more articles. On the left, you see this is kind of a daily paper of the different kind of issues and things that were going on in the Hawaiian Islands, kind of like local news. And they also had things like articles. On the right, you see this article, a story for someone named Alamira. And these were kind of like soap operas that they would have where you could read daily about, almost like how we binge on Netflix today. Back then, they would binge on these stories in written form. And this is something that everyone within the household would be able to read. In fact, the one on the left, I just realized this is a story of the Titanic in 1912, when the Titanic sank. There's a count of what actually occurred with the Titanic. We had many, many books, again, just to kind of show you the breadth of Hawaiian literacy. Everything from talking about history to there's a translation of a book about Abraham Lincoln. On the far right, you see that's a medical book in Hawaiian language. So again, the point is, even medicine were books that were used in the schools during the Hawaiian Kingdom period. Matayo Kekauanaoa, an early leader in regards to the development of education as the Board of Education during the Hawaiian Kingdom. He really understood the value of not just reading and writing, of course, but the maintenance and empowering of the Hawaiian language as the medium of the language in the schools. And part of it has to do is that this is starting to have this beginning with some of the missionary and the descendants are really trying to create schools in Hawaii where English would become the main curriculum. And during this period, just to kind of, that even Hawaiian, again, were open to what was going on. And we know that English, of course, becomes the language of the world in regards to business. And therefore, many Hawaiians who studied and could read and write in Hawaiian began to pick up and actually learn to read in English also. Again, it's a important aspect that many Hawaiians, in fact, were not just bilingual, but multilingual in the languages that they were able to read and write in. But at the same time, these missionary descendants, understood the power of language, especially in regards to identity, and the power of language in regards to politics. And so here's an image of Richard Armstrong, one of the missionaries at that time, who later on became a minister in public education. But you can see already trying to push this platform of having every so-called native child placed in a good English school. So you got to think, what is the purpose of having Hawaiians speak English? Of course, is the process of civilizing, so-called whitenizing, Americanizing, Europeanizing the so-called Hawaiians. Yeah, they understood the power of language in regards to transforming and changing and assimilating people. He also, as he says, again, this is the missionary himself saying that the language of a nation is part of its very being and never was and never will be changed except by gradual process. I mean, again, they understood that it wasn't just about speaking English. It was about understanding that English had a certain kind of power in Hawaii at this time. And so they wanted to create these so-called English medium schools. And one of the things they started to do, of course, is to fund those schools and have greater salaries and greater textbooks to give those schools better support in order to entice more and more Hawaiians to consider having an English medium education. Here's another example of Rufus Anderson. So if many of you thought that, that these guys came with love and brought, civilization and blessings to Hawaiians, well, he's an example of Rufus Anderson, secretary for the ABCFM. But in his letter, you can see, as he says here, I trust you will not fall in with the notion which I am told is favored by someone, at least in the government. Of course, it had to do with the missionaries at the time, the idea of introducing the English language to take the place of Hawaiian. So it wasn't just about having English alongside or having bilingual education. The main purpose was to replace Hawaiian, there was this idea, in fact, that for some of them, that they were afraid of Hawaiians being able to control their educational system through their own language, and that to be fully so-called civilized, they had to be replaced by English. And as he says, I cannot suppose there is design, yeah, like a plan, to bring the Saxon race, of course, who is the Saxon race, the Anglo-Saxon race, the white people, into supplant the native. Look at the language. What does the word supplant mean? It wasn't just about speaking. Supplant, of course, means you're looking to replace, to remove the people off of their so-called lands and to supplant them with English speakers or with Europeans. So this idea of, English just kind of came about in the Hawaiian Kingdom, or came about with the idea of just expanding of knowledge. Really, there was a political ideology that went along with many of these missionaries, which was what to remove. Now, this is no different. If you look at world history, you can go to South Africa. That's exactly what occurred. You can go to New Zealand. That's what occurred. You can go to Tahiti. Of course, and the best example, you can look across the so-called United States. And the settlements moved on. This idea wasn't just about so-called civilizing and assimilating the American Indians. The main purpose of moving so-called west was to replace, to supplant the native out of their lands. So language was a key to the supplanting of the people. Now, there were also, those who politically understood that, there's a contestation going on as English began to slowly gain footing in Hawaii. The main purpose, of course, of the English was really to create politically an opportunity to empower the so-called non-Hawaiians and missionary descendants and Americans and British and others here to supplant and replace the natives in governance. But there were a few so-called missionaries who had love for the Hawaiian language. It's an example of Lauren Andrews, who in fact created what's become the Andrews Dictionary, a very early dictionary of the Hawaiian language. But as he says, but for the government to set up English schools to the neglect of educating its own people in their own language would be, in my opinion, a suicidal act. He understood clearly that if Hawaiian Kingdom and their school system were one which would replace Hawaiian by English, in a sense, you're destroying the people. Here's Lorenzo Lyons, often referred to as Makua Lyons in Hawaiian, or Makua Laiana. But as he talks about, the language as a person, in fact, who is well known in Hawaiian music history. He is the writer of the famous song that we all sing in Hawaiian, Hawaii Aloha. E Hawaii e kuhon. Yeah, that's written by Makua Lyons. And as he says here, may well be classed among the best that taught to displace it or to doom it to oblivion by substituting the English language ought not for a moment to be indulged. Long live the grand old sonorous poetical Hawaiian language. And he was one of those who actually talked about not just the aesthetic beauty of the language, but in fact how more advanced the Hawaiian language was than English. But quickly, you can see as the political realm starts to change in Hawaii by 1884, as you have more and more Europeans and Americans taking control of not just the economy, but also gaining more and more political control in governance. You can see their own ideas. Again, this is an actual report of the Board of Education. Why worry over the quality of teachers in Hawaiian? We shan't need them much longer anyway. Of course, you can see this wasn't something that came from Hawaiians themselves, but this was something in which the really the white population in Hawaii at the time deemed as being what would be best for Hawaii. And of course, is to, again, supplant and replace. So the point is, if you think about what happens to Hawaiian language did not decline because of just being, an object of history. It declined because there was a purposeful attempt to eradicate it and to erase it. 1886, you can see this idea. In the future, therefore, if these heterogeneous elements are to be fused into one nationality in thought and action, it must be by means of the public free schools of the nation. The medium of instruction being the English language chiefly. So again, the idea is that they're trying to what? Create this so-called whitened public and citizenry. And what's the best way to do that? Not just physically, but mentally. is to control the language by which the curriculum and teaching occurs into becoming one of being English. Now, we're going to get into the historical lessons soon, but just to kind of remember, in 1896, the Republic of Hawaii bans the Hawaiian language as the medium of instruction. So you can see quickly after the so-called overthrow of 1893, those who then claim power to the governance. Again, if you have any doubt, this is a picture of Iolani Palace that's being military occupied by the forces at that time. But what do they do very quickly is that they'll actually ban the Hawaiian language as the medium of instruction. So you must think, why would you ban the language, not just the native language of this place, but in fact the language that virtually everyone, especially children, spoke as their first language in the island? What is the purpose of banning Hawaiian and replacing it with English? Of course, it has to do with political control, which is based upon the control of the minds of the masses. Now, the reading by Wilson and Kamana, entitled For the Interests of Hawaiians Themselves. And so that's a very important reading to kind of understand a little bit about the history of education, but kind of to really understand what's going on in the revitalization of Hawaiian language at this point. That when they overthrew the so-called Hawaiian monarchy, they knew that the banning of Hawaiian as the main language in school would what? Quote, exterminate the language. Their purpose in doing so was to exterminate. Again, you think, why exterminate the native language? It had to do, of course, with the control of the thinking of a people. Now, Dr. Warner talks, of course, about that, besides the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893, the banning of the language is also probably, they're both significant when we look at the history of these islands. And that's because the educational system is transformed, really one in which erases the Hawaiian way of thinking and is supplanted by the American way of thinking at that point. Now, how did language change occur so quickly? Well, institutions like the Kamehameha schools were really like the first institutions that were forced, I use the word forced, to transform themselves from a Hawaiian language school into one that became English. In fact, there's a very famous story where King Kaleikoa, at the convocation of the opening of the school in 1884, is asked to speak. And he comes forward and he speaks, and he does his convocation speech in the Hawaiian language. Well, the first headmaster, a person by the name of Olsen, is so appalled that the so-called savage language is used at his school that they quickly will ban the use of Hawaiian language on the campus. And Kamehameha is probably one of the first institutions that bans Hawaiian language upon its campus. So you got to think about, when we think about what makes something a Hawaiian school, Olsen, who later on, just to give you historical context, becomes part of the gang who overthrows the Hawaiian Kingdom, and in fact is responsible for helping to lock up the queen herself, Lili'uokalani, within Iolani Palace. But he's also the headmaster of Kamehameha schools. So you think about the founding of the schools, we cannot be fooled and uneducated to not realize that those schools themselves have always been part of the control of native thinking. And the first important thing that they did to control our thinking was to ban the Hawaiian language. Later on, they also banned Hawaiian culture and, of course, things like hula and so forth. But the main purpose of Kamehameha schools was not about empowering and educating Hawaiians. It was about miseducating Hawaiians and about controlling the thinking of young Hawaiians at that time. And language, in fact, was a key element in this control and really the destruction of a Hawaiian way of thinking. The mentality, look, this is 1895, the Republic of Hawaii. Again, after being taken over the so-called Hawaiian Kingdom, Hawaiians are fighting back. But the idea, the gradual extinction of a Polynesian dialect may be regretted for sentimental reason. That's all it is for people, sentimental reason. But it's clearly for the interests of the Hawaiians themselves. Again, think about it. It's for our interest that they're going to do this to us. They know what is better for us. And they're going to decide for our people this is what they must do, which of course is to therefore ban Hawaiian language as a medium of instruction. But we should kind of think about and understand a little bit about what the Hawaiian population was at that time. That in fact, in the Hawaiian Kingdom, the Hawaiian people had the highest rate of literacy of all peoples, including Americans and Europeans who lived at Hawaii at that time. Virtually everyone could read. And in fact, many Hawaiians were not just literate in Hawaiian, but about 3/4 could also read and write in English at that time also. So we were very illiterate in a bilingual sense.